it works.
All right.
Okay, so we're gonna start. I'm gonna briefly present you. So hi everyone, welcome back. So our next speaker is Bennett Knox, who's currently a PhD candidate at the University of Utah, and they are the winner of the 2022 Carl Jaspers Award from the Association for the Advancement of Philosophy and Psychiatry, the AAPP. They will be giving a talk titled Hermeneutical Pluralism in Psychiatry, Lessons from the Spectrum 10K Controversy. Bennett, the floor is yours.
All right, awesome. So first, I just want to say thank you to the organizers and to my fellow speakers. It's already been just fascinating and great. It's such an amazing opportunity. So thanks very much. I should note that I've temporarily posted PDFs of my slides on my website here at bennettwknox.com/s10k. So if you want to follow along at your own pace, or I'll leave the slides up for a few days afterwards if you want to look back at them later. So this project is kind of still sort of in the workshopping phase. It's pretty preliminary, partly because the case study that I'm talking about is still ongoing. And hopefully this is going to turn into a chapter of my dissertation. So I welcome any sort of feedback in the Q&A session. All right, so let's get into it. So here's an overview of where I'm going to go in my talk. First, I'm going to give a very brief intro to the neurodiversity framework and movement. I'm going to give some background about where I'm coming at this research from and introduce my view that I'm calling hermeneutical pluralism, or if you don't want to use the word hermeneutical, you might call it interpretive pluralism. I'm going to talk then about the case study that I'm interested in, the Spectrum 10K case study, which is a genetic study on autism in the United Kingdom. I'm going to talk about sort of the philosophical framework that I'm bringing to bear on this case study, which is the moral imagination framework from Matt Brown. And then I will sort of put the pieces together and draw some conclusions and lessons going forward. All right. So first, just a very brief, I'm sure many people here are familiar with the neurodiversity movement, and I should say that there is a great diversity of views within sort of the neurodiversity framework. So what I have to say here is just kind of broad strokes, and take it all with a grain of salt. If you want sort of a nice primer to some of the key concepts of the neurodiversity framework, I really recommend this book, Neuroqueer Heresies by Nick Walker. She's an autistic academic and neurodiversity advocate who's been writing about this for a couple decades now. So I recommend this book pretty highly. So the neurodiversity movement sort of emerged initially from discourse about autism, and that is sort of the context that I'm going to talk about most in this talk, because that's what the case study is about. But the sort of neurodiversity framework is also being applied more broadly to other sorts of things as well at this point. And the neurodiversity framework understands autism and other things that fall within the neurodiversity framework as non-pathological forms of human variation, as opposed to sort of the medicalized, pathologized perspective on something like autism. And there's a focus on sort of social support or lack thereof for autistic people and others, rather than sort of a focus on medicalization. And there's a significant overlap between the neurodiversity movement and various social models of disability. All right, so the neurodiversity movement notably rejects language of cure for something like autism, and instead sees autism as sort of a core identity that's inseparable from a person. So to cure autism would just be to destroy that person and replace them with a different one. And there's sort of heavy resistance from the neurodiversity movement at attempts to prevent autism. And these are viewed as sort of problematic eugenics. Instead, the idea is to promote a world where autistic people and other neurodivergent people can thrive, rather than trying to prevent them from existing. All right, so that's the brief intro there. So a little bit of context about where I'm coming to this work from. So in this paper, of mine, which came out a few months ago, I called for inclusion of patients in the revision process of the DSM, although I also think that the points that I make here apply to psychiatric research more generally. And I argued that psychiatry has to engage substantively with even the most radical reconceptualizations of its domain. So things like the neurodiversity movement, the Mad Pride movement, like things like this, and has to sort of substantively grapple with these critiques. And in sort of the dialogue that came out of this paper and commentaries, I came to this view that I'm now calling hermeneutical pluralism. The idea here is that we should maintain a plurality of interpretations of the things that psychiatry deals with. And some of these interpretations are going to be at least partly extrinsic to, the scientific. And they shouldn't just be reduced down to sort of scientific psychiatric understandings of the phenomena. So that's sort of like the view that I'm trying to defend, and I'm going to use the case study, I think, to try to support my view. So a bit more about what actually is the view here on the table. We sort of use the word pluralism a lot, but I want to be very specific about what I mean when I'm saying pluralism here. So what am I being a pluralist about? The interpretations of the stuff that psychiatry typically deals with. That's what I think there is and should be a plurality of. And I'm being both sort of descriptive and prescriptive here. I'm both saying, in fact, this plurality of interpretations exists. I think that's pretty obvious. And it's a good thing. This is sort of a healthy form of pluralism. And you might think, well, maybe there's a pluralism now, but it's just temporary because we don't really understand these things. And eventually we'll come to the one true interpretation of autism or whatever we're talking about. And my view also is resisting that point. I think actually this pluralism is permanent and should be maintained, and no amount of future inquiry, scientific or otherwise, is going to reduce these interpretations or should reduce these interpretations down to a single interpretation. Why? Why am I pushing for this view? Well, I think I was right in my original paper that psychiatry does have to substantively grapple with criticisms that come from the neurodiversity movement and others like it. But I also don't want the neurodiversity movement to be just absorbed or assimilated by scientific psychiatry. I want instead to sort of maintain the neurodiversity movement as its own sort of somewhat independent system of knowledge, while also maintaining the sort of contact with scientific psychiatry so that scientific psychiatry can engage with the criticisms that come out of the movement. So I'm trying to sort of sketch out and support this view here. All right, so let me get into the case study that I'm talking about. So Spectrum 10K it promises to be the largest genetic study on autism in the history of the United Kingdom. It's going to collect around 10,000 DNA samples from autistic people, along with questionnaires and sort of medical chart data about those individuals. And this data will be used for what's called a genome-wide association study, or GWAS. So what this is basically it takes sort of pre-selected areas all across the genome and scans for points at which the nucleotides in the DNA strand differ between individuals. And those are called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. And the idea is basically we gather up all these differences and correlate them with whatever the trait of interest is, in this case, autism or sort of associated conditions. And the idea there is basically we conduct this study and we identify sort of which differences between individuals make them sort of more likely to have the trait in question. So that's sort of the basics of the basic methodology of the study. And you correlate that with answers on questionnaires and medical chart data to try to, get some information about the genetic basis of autism and sort of other traits of interest. So this is direct from the Spectrum 10K website. They're saying what their goals of the study are. They say the aim is to better understand how genetic and environmental factors affect the well-being of autistic individuals, including their physical and mental health. And it should be noted that the investigators explicitly use the language of neurodiversity. They explicitly endorse neurodiversity and insist that they are not going to use the results of the study to try to cure or prevent autism, which is going to be a sticking point that will continue to come up. Okay, so the study sort of was launched in August of 2021, and then there was this massive public outcry, primarily from autistic researchers, academics, and activists, mostly working under a neurodiversity framework. And there's this statement released by sort of a group of autistic academics called Academy, and you can, click on this link to read their full statement about Spectrum 10K and their problems with it. But a few of the issues the sort of central issues that they point to: first, problems with the informed consent process of the study, the problematic history of the principal investigators. So the main principal investigator here is Simon Baron-Cohen, who, to put it lightly, has somewhat of a colorful history in autism research and is quite a polarizing figure. And lack of clarity about what the aims and sort of specific applications of the results of the study would be. There's sort of this language of we'll promote well-being, but there have not been a lot of sort of details about how that would actually come to be. And then the really big one is the potential of the data from the study being used for eugenic purposes. And how would this work? Well, so one of the things that the Genome-Wide Association Studies, GWAS, is really good at doing is producing what's called a polygenic score. So basically, we take all these sort of like differences, the SNPs that we've identified, do some fancy statistics, and then we can come up with sort of a model so that if we have a new genome, we can scan that genome, and based on whatever the SNPs are in that genome, we can spit out a number that's supposed to tell us sort of something about how likely the person that with that genome is to display the trait of interest. So in this case, autism. And the worry here is if we develop this data, we develop polygenic scores, this is going to be used for embryo screening to prevent autistic people from being born. That's sort of like the really sort of the big concern here. All right, so a bit more about the study. So as I said, it was paused in response to this outcry in August of 2021. And they're currently conducting what they're calling a consultation with autistic people and advocates. But it should be noted that the study is going to continue, and there are certain things about it that are not going to be changed, which I'll get into more detail about later. So they're sort of running this consultation on this 3-phase model, where phase 1 is deciding who should be involved in co-designing the consultation. Phase 2 is the actual process of co-designing the consultation, so getting sort of input from the autistic community about how they would want the consultation to be run. And then phase 3 is conducting the consultation itself, where there's actual discussion about the content of the study and what people would like to be changed. The dates here are not quite accurate anymore. They've been delayed somewhat. So far, they've completed stages 1 and 2, and stage 3 is currently ongoing. So the consultation itself is still happening. The consultation is being conducted by 3 sort of co-leads. The first is the Spectrum 10K team, including Baron-Cohen and his other investigators. The second is Hopkins Van Mill, which is an independent company that they've contracted, which specializes in facilitating this type of consultation. And the third is Lena Buckle, who is an autistic academic and researcher who they've recruited as a consultant for this consultation to be sort of an autistic co-lead. So at this point, sort of the most recent stuff that's come out of this is the stage 2 report, the report on the co-design of the consultation. And sort of the report outlines a few sort of key principles that have come out of this process, sort of key things that people involved in the co-design really want the study to the consultation to do. The first is to build trust in the process. So the idea here is people want the Spectrum 10K team to be as forthcoming and transparent as possible about the aims of the study, the aims of the consultation, like what they'll be able to change and what they won't, so that people can sort of have trust that they're like actually reporting accurately what they're going to do. The second is to make real and positive change to the Spectrum 10 case study. So people really, they don't want the consultation to just be sort of a box ticking exercise where it's like, okay, we gather input and then we just do what we were going to do anyway. They want the consultation to actually be able to make a substantive impact on how the study is conducted. The third is to show that the consultation involves and has been designed by autistic people. And the fourth is to create a space for constructive discussion where people can hear, learn from, and respond to a range of views. So the idea here is like neither the autistic community nor the neurodiversity movement are a monolith, and there's a great range of views within both of those communities that are overlapping, and people want as many different views to be represented in the process as possible. Okay, so however, the Spectrum 10K team is also clear that there are certain aspects of the study that can't be changed, partly because they have received a grant from a funding agency which requires them to do certain things. So for instance, the study will enroll around 10,000 participants, or at least try to. They will collect DNA samples and they will use them for a genome-wide association study. They will collect questionnaires, and they will only include people with a formal medical diagnosis of autism, not people who are self-diagnosed or self-identified. And they will share the data in sort of industry standard ways with other researchers. However, they will create a data access committee, which will oversee access to the data from the study by outside researchers. And the idea here is that the data access committee, which they pledge will sort of be led primarily by autistic people, will deny access to any researchers who are seeking to cure or prevent autism. I will get back in a bit to sort of whether or not this is sufficient. Okay, so as I said, the process is still ongoing, so I can't really draw real conclusions yet because it just hasn't happened, but this is sort of like what I think is likely to come out of this study or out of the consultation. I think it will probably lead to some substantive changes to Spectrum 10K. I think most likely this will be in areas like the informed consent process, the data sharing and data security plans, and hopefully in sort of pushing Spectrum 10K to better articulate the specific aims and applications of the study, although that one I'm less sure is going to happen. Let's see. But, and this is the big sticking point, the concern about the use of GWAS data and results and polygenic scores for eugenic purposes remains. And here's why. So this is sort of the sticking point. Here's a quote from Heini Natri, who is an autistic geneticist who works in a neurodiversity framework and has been quite critical of the Spectrum 10K study. So she says, the Spectrum 10K team, they claim to oppose eugenics, but fail to acknowledge that once the autism-associated GWAS variants are published, anyone can use the information for prenatal testing and embryo screening. The project also promises to safeguard data and to only release data to collaborators who receive ethical approval, but does not acknowledge that this does not prevent anyone from using the published GWAS results for screening. It is likely that eventually autism risk scores will be used for embryo selection, no matter how inaccurate the underlying models may be. Okay, so there are a couple key points going on here. First, the point that actually access to the full data, sort of the individual data about all the individuals in the study, is not necessary in order for other researchers to produce a polygenic score that could be used for eugenic purposes. Actually, all that's necessary is sort of the results that would be published if Spectrum 10K publishes the results of their GWAS. So the data sharing and data access committee is kind of beside the point here, because that sort of access to the data is not necessary for people to use the results of the study for eugenic purposes. And the Spectrum 10K team, at least from all the documents I've poured through, they have not really acknowledged this. That I think is a legitimate critique here.
5 minutes remaining.
All right, I'll try to speed through. I might spill over a minute or two.
That's okay, yeah.
Okay, so the other key point here is sort of Natri is responding to the response that Spectrum 10K has given about this concern. They've said basically, well, an accurate genetic test for autism is an impossibility anyway, because we know that autism, although there's some genetic associations, it's not a purely genetic trait. And like everyone seems to agree about that. But, and I mean, that's true. It is true that we would never be able to devise a test, an accurate genetic test for autism. But it's also kind of beside the point, because as Natri points out, it doesn't really matter how accurate it is or not. People will, in fact, use it for eugenic purposes, even if it's quite inaccurate. And that would still be a really problematic result for someone working on the neurodiversity framework. So this is sort of like the sticking point where it's not clear that the consultation process is really going to be able to do anything to address this sort of key problem. All right, so the philosophical stuff that I'm trying to bring to bear on this case, I'm sort of using the moral imagination framework from Matt Brown in this book, Science and Moral Imagination. So some of the key points from this framework are, first, Brown argues that scientists face what he calls contingencies, which are sort of just unforced choices throughout the research process. Things like choosing methodologies, choosing which hypotheses to test, things like that. And he thinks these are just like abundant in the scientific research process. And he argues that scientists have to exercise what he calls moral imagination when they're faced with these contingencies. So they have to consider things like the goal and task of the research, the options and alternatives that are available to them, the values that are at play, and the stakeholders of the research that they're conducting. So he's got this kind of nifty worksheet, which I'm just going to fill out for the Spectrum 10K case. So the goal and task, as stated by pretty much all parties involved, is conduct genetics research on autism in an ethical manner. Like, people pretty much all agree that's the goal here. The options and alternatives, well, the one that Spectrum 10K has picked is GWAS. But we could also do sort of other things like study genes that we already know are associated with co-occurring conditions, for instance, like epilepsy or gastrointestinal disorders that are sort of more prevalent in autistic people. And we sort of have some genes that we know are associated with that. And so we could conduct research on sort of the molecular mechanisms of those particular genes rather than conducting a GWAS. And there's sort of, other methodologies in genetics that we could consider. The stakeholders, well, obviously autistic people are stakeholders in this research. And though the study itself is only going to include people with a medical diagnosis of autism, the consultation process is actually going to include people who are self-identified or self-diagnosed with autism. So this indicates that the Spectrum 10K people agree that these are stakeholders who should have a voice in the process, even if they won't be included in the study itself. And then there are other stakeholders like family and friends of autistic people, caregivers of autistic people, autism researchers themselves, and the funding agency. These are like the people who have a stake in the outcome of this research. Then we've got sort of values that are involved. So a few of the key ones here, I think, are one thing that people, pretty much all parties involved value here is better scientific understanding of autism. Like almost everyone sort of engaged in this debate agrees that in some sense this is valuable. There's sort of the value of improving autistic well-being, which is the stated goal of the study, and which, again, all parties involved kind of agree is a value here. And then there's the value of avoiding eugenics, which, again, all parties involved say that this is a value that they hold. And so the thing here is, it seems like most of the parties involved kind of agree on what the values are, but they may disagree on sort of how to prioritize the different values, or like how to articulate specifically like what the values are. So For instance, neurodiversity advocates may put a lot of really prioritize avoiding eugenics, whereas the Spectrum 10K team sort of might more prioritize developing scientific understanding. Just one way of reading the situation. Okay, so let me get to my lessons and conclusions. So if the Spectrum 10K consultation does lead to some substantive changes, I think it could serve as a good model for this type of inclusion in psychiatric research going forward. It's sort of, it's a way for scientists to expand the range of their moral imagination by considering options and alternatives that wouldn't have occurred to them otherwise, and to respond to the concerns and values of other stakeholders in the process, like autistic people. But I think the problem here is that there was a lack of stakeholder involvement earlier in the process, sort of when, at the drawing board stage of the study, before they had even considered which methodology to pursue. And that sort of curtailed the moral imagination of the researchers at that point in a problematic way. So they didn't really consider whether GWAS was the right way to conduct genetics research on autism or not. They just didn't fully consider the other options on the table and went for this one. Some more conclusions. So I think that this case study supports my hermeneutical pluralism view. And let me say a bit about why. So as I said, the Spectrum 10K team has sort of taken on at least the language of neurodiversity, but it seems that they hadn't really grappled with some of the implications of a neurodiversity view. And it should be noted that this consultation process, it only happened after there was this huge backlash from people involved in the neurodiversity movement, both within the academy and outside of it. And without sort of a robust neurodiversity movement and neurodiversity knowledge system outside of the confines of scientific psychiatry, this consultation process never would have happened. So the argument here is basically we need to have this sort of robust knowledge system outside of psychiatric science so that we can sort of, get the scientists to conduct this sort of thing. And so I'll conclude with some recommendations about how I think we should proceed with, psychiatric research of this kind. So first, I think one way to go is to just promote autistic and neurodiversity affirming researchers in genetics and in related fields. I think, as I've argued, that we should maintain this, robust neurodiversity knowledge system that's independent of academic and scientific institutions, at least partly, although it may be overlapping with them. And researchers should do this type of process of consulting with activists and other stakeholders at the very outset of research, before they've even chosen which scientific methods they're going to pursue, which sort of hypotheses to test, that sort of thing. And hopefully, if we do this sort of thing, this will expand scientists' moral imaginations and lead to more ethical genetics research on autism and more ethical psychiatric science in general in the future. That's what I got.